So today we're going to be doing a World War III scenario where some country's going to start World War III or countries, and that one country to be starting it is going to be Russia. So Russia is going to keep invading Ukraine. They're going to start making some more pushes. I have not done what they've already taken over yet, so do that. Yeah, they're going to make some pushes into the south, but then they're also going to be facing a little bit of resistance from the Ukrainian forces there, but they will be able to make some pushes. And then Ukraine is going to try and do a counteroffensive up here, but then cut the Russian soldiers in half, but Russian soldiers will advance more into Ukraine as well. So, but then, with Russia invading more into Ukraine, this is going to pull some more countries in, so Romania and Poland are going to join in aid of Ukraine. And Poland is going to try and launch a full invasion of Kaliningrad. And by this surprise attack, they're going to make some pushes, but not too much. Also, with Poland joining in, Belarus is going to join on the side of Russia. And then Serbia is also going to join on Russia's side to backstab Romania. So in Europe, here's what we have so far. Russia invades Ukraine. Then Poland and Romania join. So this causes Belarus and Serbia to join. So it's over here now with those countries joining in. The USA is going to join in as well. So they're going to start sending some aid with the US joining in. It's going to be like Canada's going to join. Then NATO's going to start getting pulled into it. Over here, so now we have more NATO members joining the conflict to help Ukraine. Then Finland's going to join in the Baltics as well, because Russia's going to try and invade those later, or they think they will. So then when this happens, most of the NATO is already in this conflict, and so Russia is going to try and do surprise attack on Estonia, which as soon as they do that, they're going to make some pushes in pretty deep, because they actually have they would have some reserve forces up here and invade. They also do the same for Latvia. And then Belarus would do the same for Lithuania, and they would put some troops in Belarus territory. As soon as they get invaded, all of NATO joins the conflict. So every country over here, let me just get those in. Hold on one second. So every single NATO country is going to come in aid of the ones that are being invaded. So now Russia's going out in a war with all of NATO. So it's then Moldova is going to join in on Ukraine's side, because they're probably going to be invaded to help get Romania, because they're sort of like a roadblock to Romania. And then you have Transylvania up here, which mountains would be hard to push. But then Turkey joining in, they would ask for Azerbaijan and Georgia to join in to help send troops through the Caucasus region, and this would cause Armenia to join. So now we've got a ton of countries over here added in, and then we're just going to keep on playing it from here. So Russia is going to make some more offensives into Ukraine and get rid of that counter-invasion. And then when Russia invades more, North Korea is going to join in and aid in Russia. Well, yeah, North Korea is going to join in. And then we're also going to see some more pushes into the Baltics, while Kaliningrad is almost completely capitulated by Polish forces. And then we see the Estonia falling, and the more pushes into Latvia and Lithuania. Which Finland is going to try and act first and try and get some land up here and create a long border with Russia. So for then, they're going to try and make some small pushes. They're going to try and use winter war tactics, and Sweden and Norway are also going to send aid through Finland. They're going to make some pretty big pushes up into the north, and then they're going to try and circle St. Petersburg, which they would successfully encircle it at the beginning, but then that attack would be repelled by Russia. Then with Serbia joining in, they would invade Romania from the back to try and gain more land over there. But then as soon as they do that, they would try to connect with Russia, and when Russian forces do this, Russia would move a good amount of forces over here, like in Crimea, over here, and they would invade into Odessa, and then soon get into Moldova. So here's what we have now so far again, which, so Finland is trying to invade. They did a counter invasion into St. Petersburg, but failed. Estonia fell, and pretty good amount of Moldova's joined. The Caucasus is in here. So, and here's what we have so far. So now we're going to be also adding in Russia would invade and capture Riga, and then that would make Latvia fall. And then the capture of Lithuania's capital, they would also surrender. So now Russia has secured the Baltics, and they would also capitulate Moldova, which would increase the border with Ukraine when this happens. And also Kaliningrad would eventually fall to Polish forces, but now they'd have to deal with the Russian forces in the Baltics. And Belarus would also start an invasion into Ukraine in the north and move most of their forces down there. So Ukraine is in a bad situation right here. Russia and Belarus would try to make like a tail to Kiev, however you want to say it. Then over here, Turkey would immediately invade Armenia since they joined in. Turkish forces would absolutely obliterate with some other aid from the other nations. And I forgot what it was called, Azerbaijan's exclave, with all the other forces in it, which would help. So then Armenia is capitulated, and now these countries this would be a good stronghold because of the Caucasus region. And then over here, we have a ton of NATO members like Italy, Croatia, Spain, Portugal, like some other countries sending aid to the Balkans to get rid of Serbia pretty quick, and Serbia would not be able to put up with this since they don't have that strong a military. However, they would start getting slowed down because some Romanian forces would be back here, and they would eventually push out the Serbians after a week or so, probably. Then with Serbia completely surrounded, they would eventually capitulate. And then, as Moldova capitulated, Russia would try and encircle Ukraine completely, so then they would send more forces over here. And they would be able to encircle Kiev on the fall of Kiev, but tiny Ukraine would start collapsing, like some troops up here in the north. They would fall down in the south. Then Russia would do a large encirclement over here and split Ukraine into two. Most of these forces would just surrender because they know that they would not make it out, and that some of them would escape using like planes and stuff, and then go over the Black Sea into other countries, but they would soon all fall to Russian forces. So now all the Russian forces focus over here. They would then invade more into Ukraine and start making much more advances as well. And the Russian military is completely mobilized, but these countries, they're just now starting to mobilize. Except for some countries that have started early, like Poland and Germany, but most of them are just now. So we see Ukraine surrender. And then Finland would also make some more advances up here into the north, and they would try and cut off this panhandle, which would be successful. And then they would start taking more land up here since they are disconnected and hold a large defensive down there. This would be a strategic position to hold because they can also hop over here, invade, and then they can make their way to Moscow over here or like up there. Yeah. So then these countries down here in the Caucasus region, they're going to launch another counteroffensive into Russia. Since they have the benefit of the Caucasus Mountains, they have more of them in their territory really, and Russia doesn't have that much up here. They would be able to make some advances, but not that much. Which here, what we have here so far. So Russia has secured the Baltics, Ukraine, Moldova. Also, there's a good amount of land up here in the north to Finland, and Serbia has capitulated. Now, Armenia has also capitulated as well. Seeing this, Russia would ask for help, and China would join in aid of Russia. And then India, they'd ask for India for help, but India would try and stay neutral for now since they have good relations with both sides. So then Iran would join on Russia's side, so this would immediately cause Israel to join in on the side of the other NATO. And with this, these countries now see like Austria, Bosnia, and Kosovo, since Russia has made pretty good advances into Europe now since they're fully mobilized, like getting aid from other countries, they would start applying for now, like Ireland would join NATO, Switzerland would try to not break neutrality, and Austria would try to not break neutrality. But if like Slovakia gets like invaded and like Russia's on their borders, they know that they're going to be invaded because they're going to be a strategic position in the Alps and stuff, and so will Switzerland be. And then Bosnia would eventually try to join, which would be successful in Kosovo as well. Which eventually they would both apply because they're scared of Russia and it's another world war, so they would just join because nothing will. It's already escalated a lot, so not much will escalate. Which the U.S. would try to ask Mongolia to join to surprise attack the Chinese forces and try and occupy them for longer, but not yet. They would try and get them to wait, or at least connect with Central Asia. But Central Asia is probably going to be joining on Russia's side, if anything. And then we see Pakistan joining in on the red side, not NATO, because China joined in and Iran joined in. And then Algeria would join in on Russia's side, so this would cause Morocco to probably join in on the blue team side. It's Iran joining in, Saudi Arabia and Egypt would probably join. Saudi Arabia joining, Yemen would probably join. So it's now the Arab League is probably going to fall apart real quick. And then Turkey would want to invade Syria and they would want to secure the Middle East because it would be very strategic to take all that oil and use it for themselves. So Syria would join in, and so would some other countries, and then with most of the Arab League in, they would be pressured to pick a side. Some of these countries would go to other sides, some of them won't. Like Qatar, UAE, and Oman would go to the blue side. Libya would probably join the red side since they don't like a lot of these European countries. And Tunisia would probably join on the blue side on NATO. With this and all of these countries join in, and Cuba would want to join to try and take some Caribbean territory as well, so they would join in on Russia's side. Then India would finally be pressured because Pakistan joined, but they would join the blue team since they have a better chance of winning all these stronger countries. Then Mexico would also join in. Then Venezuela and Honduras would also join in on Russia's side. And then we'd have Japan and South Korea over here joining in. Then Taiwan would join in. And then the other countries like Nepal and Bhutan, they would want to be neutral, but they would eventually join on the blue side to get defense from India, from China. So they would join on India's side. And Sri Lanka would probably join in on the red team. Now, here's what we have right now. There's going to be some large battles. First, we're going to start out here at Cuba. Cuba's going to want to secure these islands, Haiti and Dominican Republic, because they'll be strategic to invade Puerto Rico and some other islands. But I forgot the name is, so these countries are not strong at all, so they'll be able to push through pretty quickly. They would make landings in Haiti, and then they would eventually capitulate it because they're not that strong of a country and they are not that stable. And the Dominican Republic would be invaded, and then they would just surrender to stop, so they wouldn't die anymore. Really, they wanted to stop as much death as possible, so they would just surrender. And then Mexico would send they would ask Guatemala and Belize to join on their side, which they would eventually, so they can invade Honduras, which they don't really like that much. So the Mexican forces, they would pretty much plow over Honduras, but the Mexican army not mobilized, and Honduras' army not mobilized, and otherwise it wouldn't be that big of battles, but Mexico would still start winning pretty quickly. And Venezuela would probably want to finish up the war with Guyana really quickly because they know that they're going to be dragging here. So let me color that territory that they have so far out of Guyana, which I think this is what they have because they're in a war right now. So it's now Venezuela would make more push into Guyana and capture these encircled forces. And then they would also make more moves into Guyana as well, with Guyana pretty much almost dead. But then the French Guiana would send aid to them. And the forces in French Guiana would eventually do a counter invasion, and then they would gain access to Guyana again. So they would try and push out Venezuelan forces, but since France would not have that much military over here, since they wouldn't have too much military over here because it's far away from them, and it is a strategic position for NATO, but it wouldn't be that much militarized. And then they would still make pushes because French Guiana is probably not as strong as Venezuela, but they are pretty strong. And by the surprise attack to Venezuelan forces would not expect this. And then Cuba would try and gain naval control of the Caribbean. If they did that for long enough, like if someone like Russia was able to hold out for long enough, like North Korea or like China and some other these countries, like some other countries join, they would eventually send aid to the others, and that would mean that they would get better, have a better chance of taking control of land. So they would just try to take these islands. They would not invade the USA because then the US would send forces over to them and they would get obliterated pretty quickly probably. But so that's what we have for now over there in the Americas. So now Finland would eventually be able to capitulate this panhandle and take it over completely, and they would try, and then Russian forces would also in the south make a bullhorn for Helsinki, because then if they get Finland out, Sweden and Norway would probably be pretty easy to roll over. So they would do another naval invasion over here in the Baltics since they have more naval control now. And they would then eventually capture Helsinki. I don't know how to pronounce it, but if I'm wrong, tell me in the comments. But they would make more pushes in since their capital is captured, and they would do a counter invasion to try and gain control of this panhandle again. And they would make more pushes into it and eventually separate it. And these Finnish soldiers would evacuate and head back to the Scandinavian nations, and they would eventually push Finland out of their territory completely. So now with Finland's collapsing, and then more forces, Finland's collapsing, so that would not be good for NATO, but then more forces down here in the Caucasus region would make more advances. As Russia would send ultimatums to Central Asia to join their side, and which Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan will, but since Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have an ongoing conflict right now, or like they're not having good relations, they would one of them would probably try and join the other side, but eventually Tajikistan would join Russia's aid. They just wouldn't cooperate with Kyrgyzstan well, but so all these countries would send, like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, they would all send their forces over here to the Caucasus region, and they would take control of the Caucasus. They're not that strong countries. I mean, Kazakhstan is sort of strong, but not really. But so them rising over there, they would eventually be able to push back the Caucasus countries, sort of, but not that much. By a surprise attack, they would be able to, and they would make because Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan would probably make some ships by now and naval stuff. So they would launch a counter invasion on Azerbaijan. Then there would be some rebels in Armenia still, and they would eventually be able to pop up. And Iran would eventually invade Azerbaijan as well. And they would be able to recapture pretty much all Armenia, down for some remaining forces up here in the north. Now Turkey would want to get full control of the Mediterranean. All they gotta do is get rid of Syria, Lebanon, Libya, and then Algeria. Turkey would invade Syria, and since Syria is not that stable right now, they have so many civil wars, they would pretty much plow over them pretty quickly. And Turkey would send ultimatums to the rebels right now, and most of them in the north would just accept because they know they're not going to beat Turkey. Then Lebanon, Israel would invade Lebanon, which would go pretty quickly. Then Syria would eventually capitulate. So over here in Africa, they would also be, Tunisia would be encircled and would be Libyan forces and some Algerian forces. They would invade Tunisia, which would fall pretty quickly, but countries like Spain, Italy, Portugal, France, Greece, they had a much powerful navy, and they would eventually capture Malta to hold as this position and put a lot of forces there, but Tunisia would eventually capitulate and fall. So, and then after Tunisia fell, Algeria put all their focus on Morocco, and they would eventually, Mauritania as well. Morocco probably does have a stronger military than Algeria, but with their combined forces with Mauritania, they would be able to make some small pushes. But then Ceuta and Melilla, I think that's how they call it, the two small lands of Spain and here. Spain would send military to those, and then to Morocco as well, when pushing to Morocco would happen. And then Egypt would try and hold out as strong as possible, but they would eventually start to be invaded by Sudan and Libya, and would start losing a pretty good amount of some territory. Egypt has a much stronger army, but Algeria would also send some forces. And then Sudan, who had been doesn't have the best relations with some of these countries. So here they would mobilize some troops and send them over here to Egypt. So then, and Yemen would try to invade Oman, which would start to go successful. Most of Saudi Arabia's forces would try to be up here fighting Iraq and Iran. They would send some down here to help. And Oman, UAE, and Qatar, they don't really have any military at all, but they can buy some stuff since they're really rich countries. So it's Yemen would start making some small pushes into Saudi Arabia as well. But then some Saudi Arabian people would probably rise up to help defend their country. So then they would start to get pushed back a little bit. And since Saudi Arabia is pretty much just desert, they would not make the best advances that much. First, then we would start over here in Asia. So then Pakistan would send their entire army to India, and they would start invading and try and take control of Kashmir. And then down here, then Sri Lanka would take whatever forces they have and try and make landings in India, which would be successful. But they would, since there's this marsh down here, India wouldn't really care that much, and they would try and hold out, and Sri Lanka would not be able to make that many advances. They would be able to push some, but India would try and hold this out as the Himalayas to stop China from invading them, because China's going to invade them. So then they would want to, India would send an ultimatum to the Southeast Asian countries, which then they would all know that the threat of China would want to take control of them. And some of these countries already do not like China, so they would probably join that on India's side. With South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, so China would eventually directly invade Taiwan and make some landings on the island. So this is this is where the population lives. Taiwan have to evacuate, and they would all run to the other side, and then eventually evacuate and probably head over like the Philippines, some other island nations out here in the Pacific, in this area. And then, but with this invasions of island nations, some of these other nations out here, like Australia, would join in to help them, and then New Zealand would join in, and Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines. Just coloring all these islands real quick. Looking at some of them on color is fine. Indonesia would probably join them on the blue team. Give them aid. And then, so with most of Asia secured by the Russians and the other forces, they would be in a pretty good position. The most strongest area would be Asia, and probably, Asia. And then if they got control of Asia, they would probably invade Oceania as well, take control of all that place. Then they would probably want to take over Africa. These forces can probably not invade Europe, because most of these countries have pretty strong militaries, like Germany, France, UK, Italy, Spain, Turkey. A lot of these countries over here in the top 10 strongest militaries. And then the USA would be fully mobilized right now in all these countries, so they would send aid down here, and to the Caribbean, like Mexico, French Guiana, and stuff. And then So Russia would then send more forces over here into the Caucasus, and China would also send some aid. North Korea would as well, and they would eventually push them out of the Caucasus. They would take South Ossetia and South Ossetia, or however you say it. I don't know. South Ossetia. I don't know how to pronounce it, but they would eventually take control of those two places, and eventually push into Georgia. And Georgia and Azerbaijan and the whatever of Armenia forces, or Armenia, would eventually capitulate. And then also the invasion of Iraq would pursue, since Iraq is pretty war-torn right now. They would eventually push the front line back completely and take a good amount of land over here. Iraq would invade Kuwait, but they would remember what they did in the past, and they would try and quickly take it over, which would be a success, and then they would launch a counter invasion into Saudi Arabia down here, which would not make much progress, and then it would eventually get repelled back by Saudi Arabian forces. And also over here, Yemen would start losing, and they would be completely kicked out of their territory, and Yemen would start falling to other forces in the region, and they would pretty much just be ready to capitulate. There'd be some forces holding out still, but the government would probably run to Sudan or some other African nation, like Somalia. Actually, no, not Somalia, because they're not good right now. But, yeah. So over here in Asia, North Korean and Chinese forces would step over into South Korea, launching a full invasion of them, and they would eventually try and take over. So they would try and make a beeline for Seoul, so they would capture it, and then South Korea would pretty much be capitulating with Japan sending aid. They would able to do a counter invasion and recapture Seoul and a lot more territory. But they would still have North Korean forces in the territory. Then China would launch a naval invasion of South Korea, a counter invasion, and they would eventually encircle all of the South Korean forces inside their own territory, and then South Korea would capitulate. Following this, Taiwan would also capitulate, and then the Philippines would send whatever they have, some of their halves over to Taiwan and try and hold out a little bit longer. And they would eventually be able to push back into Chinese Taiwan a little bit, but then they would eventually be pushed out. But Japan, excuse me, Japan would be over here, and they would be, Russia and China would want to take Japan. They would hold out a defensive position, and since China and Japan's mountains, they would send most of their population over there. In turn, they would be able to hold out pretty good. And then over here in India, Pakistani forces would then be pushed back, and they would be completely pushed out of India. And then Pakistan would threaten to use a nuclear bomb on India, and then China would, since Pakistan would threaten to use a nuclear bomb, then China would step in, and they would tell Pakistan not to do that, or China will switch sides and invade them, because they not want to go into all nuclear war, because they know that it'll kill billions in India and multiple countries. As soon as Pakistan said this, they will drop a nuclear bomb. It would make some countries change their minds. Some of Central Asia would probably leave, like Uzbekistan, and probably leave this conflict because they don't want to be a part of this. And eventually, most of Central Asia would leave, and they would all leave. Then Iran, since they're in a bad situation right now, and Iraq is not doing good. With Iraq, they would be invaded. Kuwait would be recaptured, and Iraq would be pushed back a lot more. Iran would eventually try to sue for peace, and then they would give up, and they would give some territories to pay reparations. And so, with Yemen capitulating, it's not looking good for the red team. But then Russia would try and get help from Africa, which would eventually get Angola to join in. They would get Somalia, probably the Ivory Coast, Guinea. Some of these countries might be wrong, but if they think it's wrong, some of these countries joining in, like the DRC would probably join in. South Africa would be in a tough situation since they have good relations with all these countries pretty much. They would eventually drift towards the blue team. And then like Tanzania would probably join Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and like Djibouti, Eritrea as well would join the red team. But now pretty much all of Africa Africa's gonna get pulled into this. So let's finish this quickly. Some of these countries would run and drift towards the red team, but some of them wouldn't. So it would probably look something like this for the red team. That would probably be all for the red team. There's some like countries like that have rivalries and both teams and stuff. So Eswatini and Lesotho, that would be dumb idea to join the red team. They would die instantly, pretty much. So they would not be able to get really any help. So now all of Africa is pulled into this. So it's down here in the west. It's going to be a lot of fighting I'm going to have to do. So it's Sierra Leone, Liberia would not have that much military. So whatever Guinea has, they would send down here to Sierra Leone and Guinea-Bissau as well. And the Gambia and Senegal would probably send their forces over here to Guinea and stuff and would make a counter invasion. And so would Mali would probably invade Niger. And Mali would probably have the stronger military than Niger. And they would be able to eventually capture some small territories over here, pushing a lot more. And then over here in the south, Nigeria would probably also invade Niger at the same time. And they would send most of their forces to Cameroon, and so would Chad as well. Chad's in a tough situation. And then, like, the Congo, and, like, see, these countries up north, they all border each other. They all border each other, but Chad over here, they've got this little strip of land with Nigeria. That's it. So they would, Cameroon forces would be able to push out Nigeria, and they would completely push, they'd invade Chad and Nigeria and push out. So Chad would just try and escape most of the forces over to Nigeria or other nations, and then they would eventually capitulate as well. Then Djibouti, since they have tons of military bases in other countries, they would probably kick out all the other nations like China, Russia, and they would eventually fall. Which Somalia and Somaliland would be able to break away from Somalia and would join the blue team, probably, by doing this. And down here in South Africa, and the southern part of Africa, these countries would not fare well, since these countries are pretty weak. As soon as Mozambique is invaded, and they would lose tons of territory pretty quick because they're really weak, and they're surrounded by strong neighbors like Tanzania, South Africa, which then Malawi would pretty much capitulate, so they would just surrender. And Angola would see that they're surrounded, and that they would not fare well, and Angola would not surrender, but they would try and fight off hard or hold defensive positions, but it would not go too well for them, and they would start losing tons of territory pretty quickly. After they lose a lot of territory, I mean, Angola's a pretty strong country, but not too strong, so they would eventually capitulate as well. And some of the other African nations, seeing how the rest of Africa is not going well, Somalia, the Congo, would probably capitulate as well. They would just surrender. And now, so over back here in Europe, Finland would be falling apart, and then most Finnish forces would just run away to other Scandinavian countries. Finland would eventually be capitulated, and the Norse Panhandle would get Russia, and Russia would want to take control of Scandinavia because then they could eventually invade Denmark, then Germany, and other countries. But Russia would try and do a counter. They would eventually invade Iceland, and Iceland doesn't have a military; they just have police there. They would pretty much get plowed through pretty quickly. Russia would send not that much soldiers, but they would have to send enough to where, I mean, the police forces would hold out and find that Russia would lose some forces, but Iceland would eventually fall. And then since they would then try and circle Europe, so the Americans could get in there, because there's some islands in here in the Atlantic that they could try and take over, but might not go so well. So it's then the push in the Kaliningrad would be recaptured. I'm going to speed things up a little bit here. So Russian forces would eventually push into Poland, but Poland has been mobilized for about a year now probably, and Romania as well would be pushed into. Then Serbian rebels and stuff like that would start to erupt, and they would be able to show back up and try and cut the Balkans in half, and they would eventually. And there would be some of these countries, there would be some rebels because they didn't like the war. It's like Hungary. So some of these countries, like, they would probably want to drop out because it's like France, Spain, Italy, kind of large populations would not want war. And so, like, they would not want the war to be hanging on. They don't want their country to be part of it because they have a lot of beautiful stuff there. So, like, France would probably stay in the war, but some of these countries might drop out later because Russia has been doing pretty good. They're already taking out 4 NATO members and about to take over another one pretty soon. they would start pushing more into Romania, and with the capture of Bucharest, Romania would surrender. Then all of Serbia would be cut back, and then take Kosovo, and they would start to push into Sweden and Norway. So it's over here in Asia. Japan would still hold out pretty good. India, the Himalayas, and then like the jungle, Myanmar, some other stuff. Vietnam forces would be able to hold out. And then India would eventually send some forces down here to Sri Lanka and take it over pretty quickly because they are pretty weak. But then, so seeing that the red team isn't doing so well, Iran would drop out. And then over here in Guyana as well, and in the Americas. So Honduras would be completely capitulated. Venezuela would eventually be invaded by Mexico or Cuba, and Cuba would fall. And then Venezuela would just be invaded. Oh, great. Hold up. I can fix this real fast. Hang on 1 second. But, so these countries would probably fall pretty quickly after the Mexican forces are ready to invade them. And then they would probably not provide much help anyways, because these countries are not that strong. And South America would probably want to stay peaceful in this war because they were peaceful in both world wars, but you never know, they might be pulled into it somehow. And then they would probably Brazil might join to try and take over some territory, like Colombia. So Colombia and Venezuela do not have good relations. They would probably want to take over some territory. And yeah, it would not fare too well. I gotta fix this real fast, so just hang on 1 moment, please. This is annoying. I mean, this is one of the platforms that I have to do this stuff. I mean, it's alright, but when stuff like this happens, it gets sort of annoying. But if you have any more platforms that you think I should use, I think that would be better than this. Now let's get rid of that, and then it should work. All I gotta do is just do that. There we go, borders are the same, or pretty much the same. Which now I can just, that, actually, that looks, I forgot what the borders are, but that looks fine. So, which Venezuela would, and then, Honduras would be captured. Venezuela would be completely pushed out of Guyana. They would surrender. Suriname would be invaded and surrender. So now countries in Africa are dropping out, like the CAR, Ivory Coast, Eritrea, and then, but Morocco would still be holding out, and Morocco would actually be able to push some of these forces out. And they would launch multiple counter invasions, and then completely be able to push Mauritania out as well. And then Mauritania would eventually collapse. Algeria would be pushed out of them. Landings in Tunisia would happen, and they would recapture Tunisia, then Malta as well. Then they'll eventually push out of Egypt. They would liberate Djibouti, and then more countries so Sudan would probably drop out, Libya, drop out, Nigeria would just surrender, and then Chad would be recaptured. So probably Cameroon would just surrender. And then Guinea would drop out, or Guinea would surrender. And I don't know why I painted Nigeria red. And then Algeria's in there the last 1 year, and they're not going to fare well. They just surrender. And then Algeria eventually surrender. So with the Americas and Africa completely, Oceania secure, these countries would start looking not that good. So Japan would actually be able to make a counter invasion to South Korea, and they would eventually invade North Korea. North Korea would probably launch a nuke, so they would head straight for Pyongyang, and they would eventually capture it. And they would look into nuclear weapons, and they would send them to the U.S. and they would eventually disarm them, and they would eventually recapture the Koreas. They would take over some of these Russian islands, like this one right here, and then Taiwan would be recaptured. Pakistan would eventually capitulate, but Iceland. So it's now just Russia, China, and Belarus standing. They would not. They know that they're not going to be good. Russian forces would eventually be pushed out of most of Europe, and then Caucasus would be recaptured probably. Moldova, Finland would probably be retook in the Baltics, and then made Belarus probably. Ukraine, and then China would drop out of here to sue for peace, and Russia would then be forced to surrender as well. So with this, we see that NATO won, and this is gonna be the peace treaty. So I'm gonna get that for y'all right now. Okay, so I've got the peace treaty worked out, and first of all, we're gonna start here in the Americas. So like Cuba would just become U.S. territory. Haiti, Dominican Republic would be given independence again. And also over here, Honduras wouldn't have to give up land in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, and they would still be independent. But all that's going to happen to a lot of these countries, so they have to become a neutral nation. And Venezuela have to give Brazil territory to Colombia, Brazil, and Guyana. That would be able to become a neutral nation. Then Suriname would be completely divided between French Guyana and actual Guyana. And then over here in Europe, Serbia would be completely divided, and Kosovo would be given its full independence to be recognized by all UN members. And then, Hungary would get land, Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Romania, a ton of people. And then some countries would form like a union, like Romania and Moldova, they would form a union. And then like Belarus would have to give up land to like Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Ukraine, and that'd have to become a neutral nation. Kaliningrad would be, that happened again. But Kaliningrad would become Kaliningrad would be split up between Poland and Lithuania as well. And then also, Russia would have to give up land to Norway and Finland. And then Siberia would gain their independence from Russia, and Russia would have to become a neutral nation. They'd also give up, my gosh, it happened again. I'll fix it real quick. And then also, they have to give up land to Georgia and Azerbaijan. And then also Armenia would be completely divided between Azerbaijan and Turkey. And then like Kurdistan would be independent from Iraq, and Iraq would have to drop out of the war, being a neutral nation as well. Just saw that real quick. But a lot of these places are just going to become a ton of these places are going to have to get either independence as some nations they once took out that they used to rule over, like Kurdistan and Iraq. The Kurds were quieted down before, and they'll also have to Kurdistan will be given their independence. And then also, like, there's a ton of places in China that'll gain independence. Not a ton, but there's going to be a few. I could completely divide up China and Russia if I wanted to. But I'm not going to do that. I don't really know the names of all the provinces and stuff. I'll have to do some research on that, which I could, but I'm not going to do that. I know some of them, but, like, not all of them. But, so, I'm fixing Russia real quick. So Siberia would be independent and would gain all of Siberia and would join NATO. NATO would probably just become a defensive alliance against anybody who invades a member. Since Russia's not really a threat anymore, and the Soviet Union is obviously gone, NATO would probably also become like an economic alliance as well. Like NATO and EU would probably combine together, and then it would probably, like, I don't know what it would be called, but it would lead to many more things, which after this war, many of these countries are going to be war-torn. Like Ukraine. Ukraine is going to be demolished. Russia's going to have to help rebuild and stuff like that and give them aid and money. Russia is going to be completely demolished, and it's going to have to pay reparations to other countries that they had invaded, like Georgia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Moldova, the Baltics, Finland, Norway, Sweden, but like all those. And then also, they're going to have to become a neutral nation, and if they get into a war, they will probably be targeted in it. So hope this does not mess up. Okay, it worked. Okay, so yeah, Russia's going to become a neutral nation. Like some countries, like the Central Asian countries, they would just become neutral and they'd have to pay reparations to the nations that they invaded. They want to get any land. Well, yeah, like Turkestan would gain their independence and probably join NATO. Manchuria would gain independence, but then North Korea would also be given to South Korea and they'd have to gain some land. And Mongolia would gain a lot of land and would probably become a buffer state between any Russian territory and China. I mean, Siberia's independent now, so that could be the same. But now Mongolia gets a coastline. Japan gets some islands over here. Manchuria becomes independent. Also be some more nations that, like Mongolia, would probably join NATO. Then Tibet gains independence, and then Pakistan is divided between Afghanistan and India. And Nepal, India, Bhutan, I'll get some Chinese land. I forgot to give this country some. So I'll give this little piece to Laos, since they don't have that much of a border with China, really. Small piece of land, they wouldn't probably want to get much. Then probably, countries that don't really get land would probably just be paid reparations. Like Vietnam, they didn't really play a big role in this. They just joined they just joined on their side and supported the other side. Trying to not really invade them at all because they were already focusing on multiple other fronts. But then Myanmar would gain a ton of land since they have a long border with them. So then they would be getting a ton of land and gain borders in new countries like Nepal. Borders in countries like Nepal, not Nepal, Bhutan, Tibet. And then it's China, and then Vietnam would get this island, Taiwan would get full independence, and Japan would get some Russian islands out here, like this one, some more out here. And like the Philippines, Indonesia, these countries down here, they didn't really do anything. They just supported them. And Sri Lanka would be given to India. Iraq and Iran would have to become a neutral nation. Iran would have to give land to Kuwait and Azerbaijan, like Iraq and Iran. Then same for Yemen, have to give up some land. Like Somalia land would get independence, and Somalia had to become a neutral nation. Like same for Sudan. Like these countries who dropped out, like Sudan, Libya, you can see a ton of these countries also. Like Chad became pretty big, just like these. Like here's Mauritania, then there's Algeria, Mali, Libya, Sudan, the CAR. These other countries who just supported them, like the CAR, Congo, Angola, Malawi, and Mozambique, they would just have to pay. They just supported that side. They were just if the fight did come to that, that's the side that they would support. Cameroon would have to give up some land to like Chad and become a neutral nation. Same for all these, and like Guinea and Ivory Coast would have to give up some land. So there's the peace treaty. Then a ton of these new nations would probably join NATO, like well, not a ton of them, but like the places that got independence, like Kurdistan probably join NATO, Azerbaijan, Georgia, all of Europe would probably join NATO besides Belarus and Russia. And then Siberia, Mongolia, East Turkestan, Tibet, these countries. So it's all the blue is NATO now. And well, not all these African countries, they would just get some land. Like here, like most of these, not all these countries would probably. Nigeria might join, but like Nigeria might join. Some of these other countries like Morocco would probably join. Egypt, like Ethiopia might. Somaliland. Oh, great. I messed that up again. I'm not gonna mess it, but so like here, I'm just gonna get rid of these. Like these countries probably would not join NATO. And like Madagascar probably wouldn't. I messed up right here, and I accidentally clicked something and it made all of this go away, but this would probably be NATO. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. Comment anything that you think that I did wrong, or if you have any more suggestions for videos. So what you liked about it, leave a like, sub, and I'll see you later. Bye. Thank you.